You're listening to Through the Square Window with me, Graham Kibble-White.
And me, Samira Ahmed.
This is a podcast guiding you through the UK television we watched in decades gone by.
And today we're looking at what was on TV this month, 35 years ago, in October 1990.
But before we get going, we should introduce ourselves. I'm the Telegraph's head of TV and radio, and an essential fact about me is in the 1980s, my dad made several failed attempts to video record recipes from CFAX in order to create what he described as a video cookbook.
Oh, great lost cookbook, Graham. I present Front Row on Radio 4 and Newswatch on BBC One. We had a VCR in my family from about 1975, and I've worked in TV my whole career. In fact, in October 1990, I was 1 month into that career, training as a BBC graduate news trainee, and I had a VCR of my own.
Now, there's dangling thread we need to pick up from last time before we get going, because we asked you to get in touch if you ever saw Yorkshire Television's pelt-clad glam rockers, the Animal Quackers, play live.
And Andrew Dixon contacted us to say that he saw them at Bridlington Spa, Royal Hall in, he thinks, 1976.
Meanwhile, Ian Robinson was taken to see them at Preston Charter Theatre.
Grant Atterby caught them at the Tunbridge Wells Assembly Hall sometime around 1977 or 78, and he tells us they had a clown as an opening act.
As if they weren't creepy enough. Alexander Grundy emailed to say, I remember going to see them at Preston Guildhall, so they did venture up north, sometime between 1980 and 82. I went with my auntie and two cousins. I remember getting badges, just wish I still had them.
And finally, Rich Firth says, I had an Animal Quackers double album and was taken to see them live at St George's Hall in Bradford. Well, if you have your own Animal Quacker sighting, please do let us know at email@squarewindow.co.uk.
OK, so what are we going to be looking at in today's episode?
A truly historic moment in television history. The grand opening of Florence Kite's Jam.
Side step to your left, side step to your left.
Diane, 11:30 a.m., February 24th, entering the town of Twin Peaks.
That was Watchdog, Knightmare with a K, and Twin Peaks.
But we start in a studio somewhere far, far away.
You know, it was probably TV Centre, Graham.
Picture this. Picture this.
That's the pilot of the Mary Whitehouse Experience, which aired on Wednesday, October the 3rd at 9 p.m. on BBC Two. It featured two Cambridge graduate double acts, David Baddiel and Rob Newman, and Steve Punt and Hugh Dennis, helming a topical comedy show from a kind of quasi-warehouse setting. It's a series that was created by BBC radio comedy stalwart Bill Dare, began on Radio 1 in March 89, before switching to TV, and this lone pilot episode prefigured what would be a 6-episode series that would air the following January. And we should say Bill Dare died suddenly in March this year, didn't he, Graham, in a road crash? He was just 64, but such a key figure in British comedy.
Yes, and actually almost like a lone voice, I think, in British radio comedy in terms of getting formats on the air and believing in that.
There are lots of happy memories from listeners when we said we were going to be looking at this show, including female fans. So novelist Una McCormack says, my first few weeks at uni was that period. Mary Whitehouse Experience absolutely epitomises that time period for me. Cued in Dylan's as was to get their big book signed. But I have to say to Una, have you watched this pilot episode recently? What did you think of it, Graham?
It's not brilliant, is the first thing to say. But I don't want to be mean about it because it's a pilot. But there is perhaps in this that coming of that kind of 1990s spirit of rougher, kind of self-consciously unreconstructed comedy, I think.
I must say I found it very boorish, and it had dated much worse than I had anticipated, Graham.
There's a lot of oddly jingoistic humour. I don't want to say racist, because it's not all out racist, but...
Well, it is. There's a racist joke about Irish people.
That's true, and there's a thing about German reunification, which is just teed up with a line about Germans being, in inverted commas, really ugly.
I know.
And actually, let's just listen to a quick clip about Steve Punt talking about the Channel Tunnel, which I think is quite interesting in terms of their assumptions about their audience.
What of the future? Well, probably the biggest transport project at the moment is the Channel Tunnel. But unfortunately, the Channel Tunnel has run out of money. Now, most people's reaction to this is obviously, ha 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 ha, we never wanted the bloody thing anyway. But
It's funny. People now accuse the BBC of being, woke and left wing. That joke makes an assumption, doesn't it, that the public at large are anti the tunnel, and of course, it's not turned out to be the case at all, has it?
No, and it's interesting, isn't it? Because it's in a lot of topical comedy, you get easy laughs, don't you, when you go after the baddies in public life, which I always find a bit boring and a bit disappointing. And it's really interesting to see a time when the Channel Tunnel is perceived to be a baddie in public life, and it's kind of low-hanging fruit for these comedians. But I suppose going back to, you were talking about Una's comment, and women are just not... They don't particularly get a good showing, do they, in this pilot episode?
No. Well, what's really interesting is Doon McKeegan is in several of the sketches, and she's really good in it. I mean, she's never brought on at the end. And if you read her memoir, My Lady Parts, which I have read, you suddenly get a whole different perspective on this series. So she talks about when she first worked on the radio show of it, she remembered walking to the studio, terribly excited about the whole experience, to find they were all lying about on the floor. Not one of them said hello or welcomed me. There was a general sense of entitlement in the air. Although entitlement is perhaps an understatement, I was the only woman and I felt distinctly inferior. And then she talks about be kind of essentially being made to cry by how she was spoken to by David Baddiel. It was my first ever radio recording at the beginning of my career, and it was ruined by a Cambridge-educated, entitled man-child. And then I think when they did the TV show, she said that it was going to be better, there was a modicum more respect. But cut to the live recording, and after rehearsals, the director realised we were running over. The solution: all my decent comedy was cut. I was once again reduced to a minimal feed, whining teacher, sexy mum, nerdy scholar. I wish I'd walked, but instead I gritted my teeth and got through the show willing for it to be over. I thought I would wait for my curtain call and then politely leave. I realised as they all piled backstage after the show that I hadn't been invited on at the end. I was invisible. I was the feed. They came off in a rage because it hadn't gone down better. They called their audience effing thick for not understanding their jokes. They railed at the stupidity of the crowd. They didn't give me a second glance and I left. And that's Doon McKeegan in her memoir. Now, I know, and I interviewed David Baddiel before I read this, and he talked about how he's always been a feminist. And I'd be really interested to know how the four of them would look back at that pilot and would deal with the comments of Doon, because I suspect they would probably not recognise her experience. At the same time, I suspect they would probably feel, yes, if they thought about it, perhaps they had been, I don't know. I'd love to hear from them.
I found it really interesting because it is a pilot, and so we know things are going to change, but there are none of their running skits here. There's no History Today, no Milky. But moreover, we've got Rob Newman, who would turn into this kind of lyrical, dandified comedy persona. And he's simply employed here to provide impersonations. He does Shaw Taylor, an extraordinary Top Cat routine, which maybe we might hear a little bit of.
Well, maybe, although it's a bestiality rape joke, essentially.
So maybe not. Maybe we won't cut to that clip. And he does Ronnie Corbett.
And the producer said to me, Ronnie.
But it just seems very strange that is how he's deployed. Of the four, Dave Baddiel, he impressed me the most in terms of he's the one who I think is fully formed. He is the David Baddiel that we know of today.
That's true. That is true.
Yeah, and his routines are very joined up and rigorously thought through.
There is no doubt that most people are actually excited by the prospect of war in the Gulf. It's like when a crowd gathers around two men about to have a ruck. Everybody wants the fight to happen, which is perhaps why, so far, in fact, the only placatory measure that has been taken by the West is the collective decision by Western diplomats to call Saddam Hussein by his first name. Are they being chummy? Where is it going to stop?
I remember he used to do that thing, Stab in the Dark, on Channel 4, which was basically just the kind of essays on camera. He's very much doing that, sort of padding up and down the stage, and with this sort of argument, this very developed argument that he's putting forward, whereas the others are all doing skits or impersonations.
It's interesting. Baddiel said to me that they actually took quite a long time for him to break through because there was a real anti-Oxbridge feeling in comedy after the early 80s. And of course, they were all coming out of university in the mid-1980s. But I'm just still struck by, it's four men, there's no diversity. The only woman character in it, actress, Doon McKeegan, is not included in any way in the sense of them taking a bow. And I'm just struck by how little of it made me laugh out loud. It's interesting that the writer and director Marcus Mortimer worked with Alexei Sale and Joe Brand, who I think of as kind of quite significant comedians who were challenging a sort of coziness. Yeah, I think there was a lot of progress after after the pilot. I think it says something, doesn't it, that they were given the chance. I'm not sure how many women would have been given a chance to follow up a pilot like that.
No, that's true. So there must have been the seeds of something here, though, because it was a huge success. So what can we see in here that was different? And that, do you think it is that kind of joined up thinking that we maybe hadn't had in comedy before, this sort of slightly intellectual comedy? Is that what?
Yeah, I mean, that is nice. And I do think, most of them can really act. I think Punt and Dennis's work on the Now Show showed real progress. It became very inclusive, but it always focused on topical satire. They did that very well. And they showcased a lot of up-and-coming talent. I think it's a real shame that the Now Show got cancelled. It's interesting, Rob Newman approached me about, we pitched a documentary together. And I think if you've listened to some of his more recent comedy, again, there's something unashamedly intelligent and thoughtful about it. I've watched him do stand-up actually in the last couple of years. But maybe it's inevitable that, this is stuff they were doing in their 20s and that I don't know how they would look back on it. But it's the start of something exciting, isn't it? Yeah. And there's no denying that. And some of the character types that developed out of it, you mentioned the historians. Yeah. They're great archetypes of comedy. I think David Baddiel said that he was particularly influenced by Derek and Clive, the Cook, Peter Cook and Dudley Moore double act. Their sense of just being bold and daring and, kind of going slightly out of control. I'm going to read you a bit of what Mary Whitehouse wrote about it in her diary. Now, I didn't read every page of her diary. There's so much to read. And I suspected she wouldn't have watched it. But when she was told about it, she made a note in her diary. And I think, hang on, let me find it. Right, so Sunday the 16th of September 1990, on a page, this is a quote from her diary, on a page of the Sunday Times, quite a large article about the programme called the Mary Whitehouse Experience. Up to now, this has been a late-night radio show. Now they're going to turn it into peak viewing BBC Two TV. On the one hand, I'm a nothing. No, this was the Sunday Times. Need a sense of the Lord's presence at this time. Either it's his work to his glory, or I should pack it in. But if it is, as I have always believed, then claim his strength, his joy. And so I think she she was always meditating, in a sense, on the trials that were sent her way by the mass media. And they seem to be just like, people are going to try and mock her. But actually, I think she sees it as, well, it's a sign that my profile must be something for God's work to work through. So that was her thoughts about it. But I will point out the cutting, actually, which was from June the following year. So they started touring quite quickly after the success of the first series. So she had a cutting service, and the cutting that came to her from the Daily Mirror was called Enjoy a Rude Experience. And it began, Mary Whitehouse will be mortified. The tearaway lads who stuck her name on the outrageous TV comedy series are back with an even more irreverent stage show. And at the top, she's written on the cutting, no end to it, which sounds like she's weary, but she's stuck an exclamation mark. So I think she's secretly excited. But it's interesting, what we were talking about earlier, like they're boasting about, according to this... the quotes on the article, which are quotes from David Baddiel, the material is a lot harder because we're allowed to talk about things like sex and death, says David, and we really get to slag off celebrities. Chesney Hawkes and John Major get a good pasting. And it doesn't seem that terribly outrageous anymore, does it?
Well, also, does Chesney Hawkes need a pasting? It's maybe this is because I'm in middle age now, but it doesn't feel like that's the vanguard of comedy, isn't it? It's going after the one and only. It does feel
cruel, doesn't it?
Yeah. And lastly, I can't quite match Mary Whitehouse's self-reflection on this, but I do have to point out, because we will have a contingent in our listeners, I have to point out that Nord the Vandal's helmet from the 1988 Doctor Who story, The Greatest Show in the Galaxy, appears in this episode. It's recycled in quite an overlong skit about fantasy role-playing games at the end.
Yeah, but fantasy role-playing games are very much of the moment, as we shall discuss later in this episode. Let's have a quick reminder of what was going on culturally in October 1990.
In the pop charts at number 1, we had Show Me Heaven by Maria McKee, and A Little Time by The Beautiful South, and Unchained Melody, the 1990 version, by the Righteous Brothers.
While in the cinema, new releases included Ghost, Little Mermaid, RoboCop 2 and Goodfellas.
Hosting the breakfast show on Radio 1 was Simon Mayer with Diane Oxbury and Rod McKenzie, while Derek, Do They Mean Us, Jameson, presided over Radio 2.
Graham, we have to do Do They Mean Us sometime. I was obsessed with that show. Now, the mantra of the BBC has always been to inform, educate and entertain, and I think there are few programmes which could claim that mantle better than the show we are about to discuss.
So that was Watchdog, and this episode aired on Monday the 29th of October at 7:30 p.m. on BBC One. 6 million people watching Watchdog, the BBC consumer affairs show at its peak. Now, it's claimed it began life, and this is certainly what I always thought, as a weekly segment on the Teatime news magazine programme Nationwide, I think hosted by Hugh Scully back then.
That's right.
Back in 1980. And it got its own series in 1985. But listener Mike Old has actually been in touch to say he thinks that Watchdog's roots go back a bit further to the BBC Consumer Unit, which was set up in 1973.
Which would suggest it sort of coincides with the setting up of something like That's Life. What is not in doubt, though, is that by 1990, Watchdog was helmed by husband and wife team Lynn Foldswood and John Stapleton. And incidentally, we have to say we were so sorry to hear that John had passed away about a week before we recorded this episode. Items under investigation in this particular edition included a strain of meningitis known as Hib, inaccurate food labelling, the shortfall in safeguarding the standard of second-hand cars, and perhaps improbably a look at a 90-year-old can of jam.
So let's just listen to John Stapleton's kind of opening link to the episode.
Hello and welcome once again to Watchdog. In this week's programme, the death trap still on the streets of Britain and why your MOT certificate of roadworthiness may not be worth the paper it's written on.
So it has to be mentioned, doesn't it, that from the very start of the programme, there's John using that patented Watchdog phrase, death trap.
I know. And it was so easy to parody. But my God, this programme just moved me almost, and how much it packed into that opening couple of minutes. Pure public service broadcasting. It's a flagship BBC show. And I really noticed how straight away in that piece to camera that Lynn does near the beginning and that piece about vaccines, she refers to being a parent.
Hib is a horrible disease affecting mainly children between the ages of 3 months and 5 years old. It kills 65 children a year and damages seriously another 150. What appalls me as a mother of a very young child is I'd never even heard of this disease. I'll bet you haven't heard of it. Yet there's a solution, and we aren't going to be offered it for years.
She had this great knack for dropping in a personal reference in an entirely appropriate way. It was never about her. It was about her representing citizens, and her sense of moral and ethical outrage on audience's behalf was just, as I say, I find it deeply moving. It reminded me of why we loved her so much. And I've got to say, as a parent, I had my first child 9 years later. Hib vaccines was something that my generation of young parents were all very aware of and we took for granted, thanks to the campaigning of Watchdog to make sure it came in.
I found this, as you said, it's quite moving, but it's really robust and brisk. They're talking about infant mortality, and yet it's sort of not glibly, but it really trots along. They're not trying to mine pathos. They're not holding a camera on a mum until she cries, are they? No. It's a really effective way of dealing with this issue.
You said something really important when you said it trots along. Nowadays, despite the fact we think of attention spans as being shorter, they milk everything and it takes ages to get to the point. Whereas this, bang, 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 they're into 2 or 3 different parents. You get tragic stories. You have no sense that they've not listened to them carefully. But the audience isn't encouraged to linger for the sake of it, to make it more, to milk the emotion of it. And then we move on. And she does the same with the toddler reins item, which is very short, when she says she'd rather, personally, they weren't on sale. And this sense of editorialising, I'm fascinated by the freedom they had. It's based on her experience and her judgment as a consumer journalist. She's trusted to give that opinion that viewers will take away and might well act on.
Is it dangerous, though, in terms of as a representative of the BBC, is it dangerous to add those little editorial elements in? Is she walking a thin line?
Well, it's interesting now when you've got all these kind of contested views on things like vaccines, don't you? And in those days, you didn't have the internet. I think people relied much more on the robust fact-checking of journalists. I think at the BBC, standards were high. There was a real sense of responsibility among journalists about what it would mean if you got something wrong. And a lot of these journalists had come from press backgrounds. I think Sue Bishop, who I was chatting with on the Newsnight Oldies WhatsApp group that I'm on, she was a reporter there. She was a reporter on this edition of Watchdog. She'd come from the papers. So a lot of them had a very, very practical background as consumer journalists, took their responsibility seriously. And the producers on it, there's a big overlap with news and current affairs. So I looked at the credits for this episode. Aidan Laverty, who I worked with on Newsnight 2 years later when I first went there as a news trainee, he went on to edit Horizon. Alice Beer, who was a production team member then, future presenter, had started out, in fact, on That's Life. And the editor of Watchdog, Sarah Kaplan, went on to set up Childline with Esther Ranson, and I think is married to Nick Ross. And she's also, incidentally, a trustee of the Migration Museum. So just got a real sense of all these people were very much engaged in public service journalism, and it really shows in every aspect of this team. And the studio it was made in, I mean, the fact that they crushed one of the cars that they've been showing us, which has been sold with a dodgy MOT and wasn't safe to drive, and they'd obviously taken it to a crushing yard, got it crushed, and then brought it in and had it for a 20-second payoff shot. And I just love that they did that, because it just tied up the story. So it's really well told. It's good television. It's not just telling you stuff that you need to know. It's made in a very entertaining way.
And talking about lighter touches, it does feel, so we mentioned this World War I can of jam, that they are looking for leaving in a little bit of fun items, aren't they? That they always decide, well, we're going to have, this is the thing to leave the viewers with a smile on their face. And they've got this campaign where the audience are sending in things they've bought that are still surviving, which is great fun.
Now, Florence Blesser is 90 years old, and she inherited this tin of Hartley's black currant from her mother, who kept it in her larder all through the 1914-18 war.
But we have this really kind of low-key ending, don't they, where John Stapleton attempts to open the jam and taste it, and then kind of demurs and decides he's not going to, he might sniff it. It just felt a bit of a weird tonal shift.
It seemed harmless. You're speaking to a woman who has a jar of cocoa powder from the 1980s that is still in my... I can't bring myself to throw it away. I don't use it, but it's still there.
Maybe on a future episode you can kind of, prise it open and we can have a look.
While we were recording, I got an email back from Valerie Singleton, and she, of course, had done a special for Nationwide on metrication, as it was called. And she said, yes, hello, Samira. Yes, I did something called Consumer Unit. I think I joined Nationwide about 1973, and we were joined by Richard Stilgo, who created wonderfully funny sketches about products. I became a main member of the Nationwide team about 1976, so the Consumer Unit must have run its course. Isn't that brilliant? So thank you, Valerie Singleton, for updating us. So it looks like the Consumer Unit is the kind of origin of Watchdog after all. Now, in terms of TV audiences, there are just two shows which shared the number one slot between them in October 1990, Coronation Street and EastEnders.
Yes, the soaps are getting around 17 million viewers each, with Neighbours stuck in third place at a paltry 15 million. No other programme could touch them, really, with sitcoms Bread and Hello Hello plus ITV entertainment shows, Blind Date and Beatles About pulling in audiences of around 12 million.
And the satellite wars were heating up, with Rupert Murdoch's Sky Television poised to swallow up rival British Satellite Broadcasting's 5-channel service just months after the latter's launch. Now, if you only discovered Dungeons and Dragons through watching Stranger Things like my 20-something daughter did, then it's time to learn about the real thing, Knightmare with a K.
Welcome, stranger. So this is Anglia Television's superb sword and sorcery themed game show for children, the vision of producer Tim Child. And the episode that we've watched is from the 4th series. It aired on Friday the 5th of October at 4:45 p.m. on ITV. The series was launched in 1987. It was hosted by Hugo Myatt in the role of Treguard and featured teams of 4 kids, one of whom dons the helmet of justice and enters a fantasy dungeon. Now, in truth, this was actually a studio with blue drapes, and the whole environment is a computer-generated background dropped in by blue screen. While the helmet handily blocks the Dungeoneers' visions so they cannot see the bare studio, their movements are guided by 3 remaining players who are watching on via a monitor in Treguard's lair.
I'm shocked that you say drapes rather than curtains, but anyway. Now, in this episode, Treguard was joined in this series by a sidekick, an obsequious elf called Pickle, played by David Lerner. And our brave players in this episode are Harry, Martin and James, with Dungeoneer Alistair.
Ah, I suppose you want to know what I'm selling. Well, I'm afraid that depends on what you're buying. And talking of buying, what are you paying?
Alistair, So you'll play some girls. Yeah.
I'm fascinated by the fact that I love this show because I had left university by 1989, and I think I stumbled across this as a university student in my holidays, and I think as long as it ran, I would try and catch it on a Friday afternoon. I just love this show. It seems to me it captures the golden age of very late 80s, early 90s ITV alongside things like Children's Ward, which we must do in a future episode. And it has the great children's quiz tradition of 2 timelines. So there's a 25-minute run of the episode, but that doesn't mean that the gameplay fits that. The reality is when teams fail or progress, that's when things change. So we often join and leave mid-adventure, which I think is very compelling. And actually a show like Blockbusters did something similar.
Yes, that's true. I mean, it's a soap opera in a way, isn't it? It's there is this ongoing narrative. So I was 17 and I watched it as well. And yeah, like you, outside the core demographic. But there's something really addictive about a programme that is really, well, it's so imaginative and it's really pushing against the restrictions and really making the restrictions of the studio setup work for it. So it's kind of early days for computer-generated landscapes. But actually, they hold up well, don't they?
They do. So I was reading that Tim Child, who created this, is still very much working, I think, in screen work. He was inspired by ZX Spectrum games. I think his sister worked for Clive Sinclair. And so it's the use of chroma key, blue screen. Nowadays, it's green screen. In those days, it was blue screen. And I remember this was the early days of it being used at the BBC too. There's a great pioneer of it. There's a real sense of peril. It's a tough game. Apparently, only 8 teams won in 8 series. And it had spin-offs. I saw a Knightmare Choose Your Own Adventure book in a shop the other day, and I nearly bought it for research, and then I thought, Samira, you can't justify that. But I noticed there was a board game which sells for up to £80 on eBay if you've got all the pieces. There were Spanish and French TV versions which ran briefly, and Tim Child tried to sell a US version, but in 1992 with NTSE, never the same colour as we used to call American TV screen standards, and very little understanding or interest in the technology, it never happened. And I think it's so interesting that this is one of those shows where the Brits were absolutely ahead of the game. And the gameplay is exciting. You've got the skull that appears occasionally to warn you that your life is declining. There's an arachnid that appears, and you know that he's got to be directed to move. And I think we're going to spoil it and say that Alistair, I'm afraid, does not survive the episode because of the whirring buzzsaws of doom.
You're right, Alistair. Move now. 2 steps. Stay. Now guide him well, team. Guide him.
Right. Side step to your left. Side step to your left.
There are blades coming at you.
Side step to your right. Right. And again.
Oh,
we're dead.
Dear, what a pity. Well, I suppose that's just a slice of life to you.
Such a banal death.
It reminded me of, I think a few years ago, for nostalgia, I think I downloaded some old ZX Spectrum games, and they were unremittingly merciless. So it's in terms of if you're 1 pixel wrong, you're dead. And it's very, very binary. And this is what Knightmare is like. So these poor kids who have put days and weeks into this quest, solved so many puzzles. And then, as you say, he's in a corridor with buzzsaws coming up, and he dies because they don't tell him to sidestep to the left sufficiently. I know. And then it's just suddenly over. It's quite it's oddly mature in some ways, in that no quarter is given.
I know, I love it. And also, the 3 in the studio, they're holding clipboards with pencils and paper.
Yeah.
It's very low tech in the sense of what's required of you to watch it and play it. And there's no codex. As someone who's got a child who plays Warhammer, where the rules are really complicated, you could just pick it up going along. You sort of see this in a room, and there's a chap offering him 3 things. Do you have any gold to buy it with? What are you going to buy? You mustn't buy a weapon. So there's some messaging there which is really nice, and you know that picking up a magnifying glass is probably going to be useful in some way, but you don't have to memorize a load of rules to play this game.
And it feels to me like a safe space for nerdy kids in a way, isn't it? This celebrates the boffin. This celebrates the creative thinker, the kids who might be outsiders, at school. I'm over-stressing it, overthinking a bit. I think it's a lovely haven for them in a way.
It is. And it's interesting that, in this episode, you've got an all-male team followed by an all-female team. So I thought it felt really nicely inclusive without it being overly laboured. And they all struck me as being quite clever and, yes, probably quite middle class. But, I'm not going to hold that against them. I'm fascinated to know how they recruited. I think they got a lot of applications for this show. I mean, it's There was a documentary I found on YouTube marking its 25th anniversary. The love for this show is really deep. I wonder why you think that is, Graham.
I think because I think television, there's something special in television where there is a gap left for the viewer.
Yeah.
And I think there's a huge imaginative gap here, because when you watch it sometimes, if you were dropped into the episode partway through, you would think, my God, this is so stilted and so clunky. The whole right a bit, left a bit, turn that way mechanic. And yet you're filling that gap, aren't you, in terms of it's very immersive.
It is immersive.
And you have to do a lot of the work to get on board with the show. And I think that's still incredibly appealing. And even there's one of the things which I think was new for this series was they have this thing called the eye shield, which means that sometimes they can cut to basically what is stock footage, or what would be called in a kind of computer game parlance a cut scene, which is going to get the kids now more from A to B. And one of the children has to say dutifully, it looks like the eye shield is guiding us through this moment, just to kind of paper over it. But I just like this whole inclusiveness that all these people are coming together, these youngsters, and Pickle the Elf and Treguard, and just imagine this world into being.
So we've got to emphasise, I still think it looks really good. There's almost like an early pop video sort of colour wash on some of the footage where, you're walking up to a castle. I don't know how they did the one where he's climbing in and out of a boat, because I'm guessing they didn't really have a boat on water. But it looked good enough to me, even if it's all done in a studio, that it seemed like it could have been done. And I like the fact that this wore its technology quite lightly, considering how cutting edge it was. I also noticed that the CBBC show Raven, shot in Scotland, I think, absolutely copied the presenting style. And I loved that show as well years later. And I'm really struck by how good the storytelling was. I really am.
I just wanted to return to what you were saying about the aesthetics, because I have a theory with these kind of shows, with sci-fi shows, that sort of like 10 years after something like this airs, 10 to 15 years, they look at their worst. But now you get to 20, 30 years, suddenly that aesthetic, kind of you age into it. And it does look nice. And I guess it almost looks like it's a creative choice rather than a limitation now, doesn't it, when you look at it?
Well, it's interesting if you think about something like the Adventure Game, which had been running a few years, hadn't it? It was more of an early to mid-80s show, which was very similar, early chroma key, a sort of playful tone in some ways, but also a real sense of jeopardy, of those celebrities getting vaporised if they jumped onto the wrong square. And I'm just interested in how there's a little sort of cul-de-sac of television shows which do this immersive new tech stuff, and it doesn't really go anywhere. But then you look at how theatrical events now, so much of it is immersive storytelling of this kind, the kind of the locked room scenario. That's essentially Knightmare and the Adventure Game, aren't they?
If the Adventure Game was on now, I mean, you would absolutely be the kind of celeb that would be going on in a team, wouldn't you? I can see you, Graham Garden. Let's think of one other.
Richard Stilgoe, who is still around. I would want to be on a team with Richard Stilgoe.
That you would absolutely ace that. We should say, we talked a bit about Tim Child. He also did, because I had BSB. I had a BSB Squarial in 91, and he had a show on there called The Satellite Game, which was really similar. So it was, but it was going through kind of spaceships, and actually David Lerner, who plays Pickle, he was on that. But this is definitely an itch that he was scratching. Do you remember Cyberzone, the show that they did on the Def 2 slot, which was presented by Craig Charles?
I'm not sure I did. No, I watched Robot Wars, which was a bit later.
Right. So this was a wholly VR thing, which, in 93, it's really early to be getting into and thinking that VR is going to be in any way televisual. But I really admire that, Tim Child's kind of ambition and his willingness to make himself vulnerable to technology and the limitations of the technology. And
it's interesting when the BBC have experimented with cutting-edge technology, because they did a show, it was aimed at very young children on CBeebies, I think, and it was the idea that you watched people playing a game, but then there would be a moment where you'd play the game at home on your phone or something.
Right.
And I just remember we were shown it and we were all encouraged to play it. I can't remember if we were reviewing it on a programme I was working on, or it was just because of work I was doing with the BBC at the time. But I remember thinking, this is being led by the idea of we must make a game that is interactive for children. But the gameplay wasn't exciting enough. There wasn't enough of a follow-through. It had the superficial feeling of being immersive and interactive, but it wasn't in any meaningful way. And Knightmare was, even though it was all pre-recorded and the only interactivity was you choosing to engage in watching the episodes. Well, it's time to do something else very eerie, is it not, Graham?
Yes, although this is eerie in a completely different way. So, of course, that ponderous music was Twin Peaks, which launched on BBC Two on Tuesday, the 23rd of October at 9 p.m. The cult TV drama was created by David Lynch and Mark Frost. It told the story of a murder and an abduction in the fictional Pacific Northwest logging town of Twin Peaks. When Laura Palmer's body is discovered, at the top of the show, FBI Special Agent Dale Cooper, played by Carl McLachlan, is brought in to investigate. Now, one thing about this series, and I was talking to my wife about this yesterday, was we both had memories of knowing about it before it launched, to the point that I knew there was a line about who's the lady with the log. We call her the log lady. And I'm always fascinated with those kind of memories because you think this is really pre-internet. How is this news being disseminated? How are we hearing about it?
Well, what's really interesting is we think of news shows starting in September, but this show actually originally aired in April 1990, so 6 months or so before the BBC starts showing it. So it's plenty of time for the buzz about it to have grown in America and to have been picked up and reported by the UK press. So when it arrived complete with a reputation. And I didn't really watch it on original transmission. I heard a lot about it. I stumbled across odd episodes of it quite late, possibly even into the second series. A lot of the stuff where the dialogue was recorded backwards and then played in reverse, that eerie, the other room stuff. But I interviewed Mark Frost, the co-creator, very recently about it. And he was hugely influenced by The Prisoner, the British television show, that sense of the world building where, there's all this strange stuff going on and you're gradually starting to find more and more corners and you're trying to work out your place in it, which I think helps explain why its mood and atmosphere is so compelling. But the other thing, which really was interesting to find out, was the whole plot was inspired by the trauma of a real murder. And when he was about 13, a friend of his had a sister who was at boarding school in Canada, and she was murdered by an escaped convict and found just like Laura Palmer's body. It was horrific. And his parents went up to get the body, and the boy came to stay with Mark Frost. And Mark Frost's parents said, look, this has happened to his sister, but he doesn't know, so don't say anything. So that whole weekend, Mark knew about the trauma and couldn't say anything. And he said, it's haunted me the rest of my life. So the series came out of that. And if you watch this opening pilot, the first 20 minutes of it is all about the trauma for the family and the friends and the school staff of finding out this death. It does not play lightly with the murder at all. And considering how later on it was all about the meme, who killed Laura Palmer, I felt the focus shifted onto all the other weird, otherworldly stuff. I thought at its heart in this pilot, it's focused where it should be, on the trauma of a terrible murder and the horrific abuse of these young women, because there's the girl who's been raped and found alive, and then there's another murder that's been reported elsewhere.
Yes, I mean, that's really interesting. I actually wasn't aware of that background because I was really struck by, I don't remember a TV show that depicts grief as painfully but sits within the grief as well for as long as Twin Peaks does. And I just want to play the clip actually where we've got Leland Palmer, Laura's dad, and he's on the phone to his wife, Sarah, who is worried that, the daughter hasn't come home. And Leland sees the police arrive at his place of work, and they both then realise what this must mean. So let's just listen to that.
Honey, what's wrong? What's this all about?
She's not here. She wasn't here this morning.
Well, she's probably with Bobby.
I can't find Bobby.
Well, there they are. That's it. Let's not worry. I mean, they're probably together.
She would have left a note. Why didn't she leave me a note? She would have told me.
Honey, take it easy, please.
Excuse me. I'm looking for Leland Palmer.
Yeah, he's right over there on the phone.
Sheriff Truman.
What? Who? What did you say? Oh my God. Oh my God. Oh my God. Laura. No. Laura. Oh, Leland, please. What is it? Tell me.
in most shows, I think the camera kind of absents itself, doesn't it, from the grief moment. It's particularly in an ER, for example, or something. You often then cut to outside the room as the news is being imparted to the bereaved people. Here, you're in it, and people are howling. And the other thing I really noticed and thought works brilliantly is grief is almost like a contagious, isn't it, across this episode, as it spreads across the school as people hear about it. It's really fascinating. It really sits in it.
Yeah, and it reminded me of two different 1950s American things. It reminded me of Rebel Without a Cause, and that sense of, you remember when Natalie Wood is taken to the police station and she's in a hysterical state and the police officer's trying to calm her down and work out what's going on, and her father comes. You have that atmosphere of a show that feels sympathetic to the young and their traumas, and it's also reminded me of, in its own way, a very different thing, which is Peyton Place, which was, I think, based on a novel. And it was quite a scandalous movie that was made about this thing where, under the veneer of civility in a small town, there's incest and rape and affairs and all these terrible things going on, which, of course, is exactly what is happening in Twin Peaks. But you see its influence to this day. I mean, even a show like Riverdale, which was spun off out of the Archie comics, has that sense of, the sort of the beautiful teenagers, but what darkness might be lurking beneath. I think this really does change television, doesn't it?
It really does. And we mentioned Stranger Things as well. I think Stranger Things is incredibly influenced by this. That sort of, I know, obviously Stranger Things gimmick is that it's set in the 80s, but it has that kind of 80s obsession with the 50s that you have, which Twin Peaks does. You have things like small town setting, teenage rebellion, roadhouses, coffee bars, these school kids in kind of football blazers. Which means that the show has dated incredibly well, hasn't it? It looks like, other than the fact it's in 4:3 aspect, it looks like what they would call prestige television still. It looks fantastic.
Diane, 11:30 a.m., February 24th. Entering the town of Twin Peaks. It's 5 miles south of the Canadian border, 12 miles west of the state line. Never seen so many trees in my life. As W.C. Fields would say, I'd rather be here than Philadelphia. 54 degrees on a slightly overcast day. The weatherman said rain. You could get paid that kind of money for being wrong 60% of the time. You'd be working.
I was interested in how humour emerges quite gradually. If the moment you meet Agent Cooper and he's talking to Diane on his little tape player, and he's talking about the coffee and the cherry pie, and there's a scene later on where the woman who works in the sheriff's office has laid out muffins in a little grid, and he's so excited about seeing the sweets, and it's done quite lightly. It hasn't sort of. I quite like the way that all these characters develop off into their own little personal obsessions. And that's part of what fed, I think, the fandom in the early days of the internet to come, when people are sort of on those websites on places like GeoCities, aren't they, and talking about all their different fan theories. It comes out of this. The one thing I want to say is, once you know where this is going, and a lot of people know that, it turns out that there's a lot of these teenage girls are involved in prostitution. And the Sherilyn Fenn character,
Audrey,
who's one of Laura Palmer's friends, she's behaving so oddly in this first episode when she says, my friend was found murdered, and she deliberately does it to sort of, ruin a business deal with all these Norwegian businessmen. I felt uncomfortable at the way that was shown, but I did value the way that these women were behaving, these young women were behaving very strangely, because they're all abused. I just questioned how much of the abuse we ended up seeing on camera for how long. And I went to see Firewalk with Me, the Twin Peaks film, without having watched much of the series, which kind of is, if you watched it after watching the pilot, it would explain exactly what had happened leading up to the pilot. But I just felt it just dwelt on the torture and the abuse in very explicit fashion, which I didn't understand why it had to do that. I felt very uncomfortable with that.
Well, tonally, it is, I want to say, all over the place, which sounds like a criticism. I don't necessarily mean that. And it's incredibly bleak at times. And you mentioned Agent Cooper, who he's kind of a breed apart from all the other characters in a way. He's got such a lightness of touch. He's coming from another world. And Audrey is a little like that as well, in terms of how she is reacting to things. So I guess within that, it makes the show interesting, and certainly I can see then that prisoner influence. But within that also, maybe things can be miscalculated, a bit of a misstep in terms of the cruelties, as you were saying, that it can't quite encompass all these things at times. The other thing I found really noticeable about it is the incidental music, which is really omnipresent.
Yes.
It's really effective.
It's a character in the film.
It really is, but it sort of reminded me of Curb Your Enthusiasm in a way, in which I think Larry David had just got stock music. I know it's not stock music, but it almost sounds like stock music because these cues come in again and again and again. And sometimes it's incredibly sort of syrupy and sometimes melodic. But it really seems to work well, doesn't it? Even though it almost seems to be a bit heavy-handed.
Yeah. I'm interested in what impact you think this has on British television. I mean, I know we start to get shows like The X-Files and that whole sense of the otherworldly and the occult in American dramas. But do we see anything like it in British TV that works?
There was an element of trying to do this slightly more quirky and mysterious thing. Something like Virtual Murder comes to mind, which was a very unsuccessful attempt at doing that. Or something like maybe even Neverwhere, the adaptation of the Neil Gaiman story, where things are heightened. So it's not necessarily, I think, tapping into the themes of this show, but it's tapping into that kind of heightened reality. But I don't think that British telly sustained that. It also had this huge kind of influence on an adolescent audience. The thing I particularly remember about it was the merchandise that there would be around this. There was the Twin Peaks tapes of Agent Cooper, which was an audio cassette, which Carl McLachlan recorded of his memos to Diane. And I have to say, by the way, that memos to Diane thing has got to be one of the best ever conceits in telly, hasn't it, in terms of getting some storytelling done. It's so superb. And I think...
how does it work? Would he send them off to her at the end of each day?
Let's not think about it. I think that...
No, because you don't... when you stop and think about the mechanics of it, it doesn't really make sense. But you're right, as a piece of storytelling in television... It's
superb. Yeah.
Superb.
Yeah. I think I had a copy of The Secret Diary of Laura Palmer. I don't remember if I read it, but for some reason I felt I had to own it. And McLachlan did ads for Ruffles crisps, which he had to describe as darn fine because damn was considered too strong a word by the advertising industry. But it seems really weird that such an obtuse, odd, hard to get into show also becomes a mass media event.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Like it was like the internet had to be invented because there was a demand for it. I mean, what Twin Peaks shows was there were enough of us who were watching TV late at night, and this is true of Moviedrome as well, which has also had a huge cult following over the years, and that people were looking to share their fascination with it on forums, and that speaks to the power of the storytelling, the success of what David Lynch and Mark Frost created, but also the way that audiences wanted something more. They created their own landscape around the show, didn't they? I mean, I was interested as well in what the actors who were in it. I mean, people like Lara Flynn Boyle, Sherilyn Fenn, they all went off into films, often into sort of quite dark noirish films. So things like Red Rock West, I think. But long term, I've not seen them have the careers that I feel they should have done. And I think that says something about... it's groundbreaking up to a certain point, but how far do the women, the female actors, really get to break out of the confines of playing, abused or exploited women or femme fatales?
The last thing I wondered what struck you about the pacing, because it did make me think of a Netflix prestige show. Now, I always get angry at Netflix shows when people say, well, no, you've got to watch up till episode 3 because that's when it really gets good, whereas my sense of a show is, no, it should really get good by episode 1. Now, Twin Peaks, we should say it's a feature-length opening, and it does get good, but it's kind of languid, isn't it?
It is, and I deliberately watched it on normal time. I didn't watch it at 1.25 as I'm sometimes tempted to do. And actually, I did find it completely compelling because it's so beautifully shot. The music is atmospheric. The acting is compelling because partly, as we discussed early on, that sense of just diving into and staying with you in the discomfort of the trauma of that family was, you just thought, I'm being taken somewhere I've not been taken before, and I want to stick with it. I think a lot of it was to do with consuming it late at night. Remember, in real time, most people weren't necessarily taping it, and watching it late at night. I think a lot of it is the atmosphere of the consumption, isn't it, when you're consuming it. It's a solitary watch, and that's when it kind of really draws you in when you're watching it late at night, perhaps slightly drunk. I don't know.
Next month, we're going through the square window to look at TV from November 1984, including the last ever edition of Rent-A-Ghost, the TV movie Return to Waterloo, which was the brainchild of Kinks frontman Ray Davies, 2 female-led police shows, Juliet Bravo and The Gentle Touch, plus Bob's Full House.
And as Bob would say, our doors are always open for you. So if you want to share any thoughts with us on those programmes or on anything from this episode of Through the Square Window, please do drop us a line on email at squarewindow.co.uk. That's it from us. Goodbye.
Goodbye. I like it we wave.
I always like to wave. I have to wave at the viewers.
Got to do the wave. I think it helps the tone of voice, doesn't it, the wave?
It does. It does.
Thanks for listening to Through the Square Window.
This was a Square Window production with music by local teenagers.
Our podcast logo was designed by Stuart Manning.
Do subscribe and tell other people about us.